The committee will come to order. The announcement on July 18 that the United States and India were transforming their relationship into a global partnership has been greeted with an array of reactions in this country that range from elation to complacency and even to alarm. In truth, it's difficult for someone not privy to the relevant negotiations to judge the agreement's merits, especially when conformed with its very general and anodyne declaration that the U.S. and India will, quote, work together to provide global leadership in areas of mutual concern and interest, close quote, such as promoting stability, democracy, prosperity, peace throughout the world. Such sweeping statements require close scrutiny, which is why we've asked you gentlemen to appear today. This agreement has been portrayed by the administration and many others as being of great strategic significance. Perhaps it is. Few can question the significance of India's growing role in the world or the importance of our having good relations with that enormous country. However, the larger geostrategic impact is more uncertain, as the consequences of this and subsequent agreements on the alignment of forces in the new international system now emerging will take many years to become evident. More concretely, given that India, as with all countries, can be expected to act in its own interests however it conceives them, what assumptions are we making regarding the impact of this agreement on India's perceptions and likely actions? Will it in fact change anything? Will we secure India's cooperation in areas that otherwise would not be forthcoming? Have we already done so? It also appears that in addition to the commitments outlined in the public announcement, several understandings of one type or another have been reached between the two parties, some of which may have been consigned to writing, others perhaps encapsulated in a wink and a nod. To the extent that it is possible in an open hearing, the committee would like to learn the entirety of our expectations. The announcement of the agreement lists a number of cooperative policies the two countries will undertake, including several in the areas of trade and economic development, the environment, and space exploration, among others. Although in general these initiatives appear to be worthy endeavors, their collective substance leaves a lot unsaid. Clearly, the most important elements are those concerning combating terrorism, especially weapons of mass destruction, as well as the more controversial promise of cooperation regarding India's civilian nuclear energy program. Judging the likely impact of this agreement on U.S. interests requires weighing these factors in two separate contexts, one nestled within the other. The first is whether the net impact on our non-proliferation policy is positive or negative. If the answer is the latter, the second and larger question is whether or not the strategic benefits gained outweigh any potential damage to that same policy. Those, in a nutshell, are the questions I hope you gentlemen can help us resolve today. I look forward to being enlightened by your testimony and by your answers to the questions that will follow. And now let me turn to my good friend Tom Lantos, the senior Democrat, for such remarks as he chooses to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I was listening to your extremely nuanced and sophisticated and knowledgeable comments with great care, and they reflect many of my own views. Before I come to my prepared statement, prompted by your observations, Mr. Chairman, let me make a general comment to the administration. When the administration called me asking for my support for the issue we are now about to discuss, I gave it, and I continue to do so. But as I sense from your observation, Mr. Chairman, and they certainly reflect my views, there is a degree of reciprocity we expect of India which has not been forthcoming. The policy of India towards Iran is a matter of great concern to many of us, as is the policy of Russia towards Iran. The United States, after very careful consideration, agreed to our three European allies attempting to conduct negotiations with Iran with the anticipation that these would yield results. Indications at the moment are that they have not yielded results. And the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, along with us, are prepared to refer the issue to the United Nations Security Council for action. Russia has publicly stated they will object to that. And it is my intent to introduce a resolution denouncing this Russian action by the Congress of the United States. I would not like to see a similar set of developments with respect to India, whereby we agree to undertake a tremendous range of path-breaking measures to accommodate India, while India blithely pursues what it sees should be its goal and policy vis-à-vis Iran. There is quid pro quo in international relations. And if our Indian friends are interested in receiving all of the benefits of US support, and I personally indicated my support for India as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a position which is ahead of the administration's policy because the administration, as I understand it, does not yet support any of the other potential candidates. We have every right to expect that India will reciprocate in taking into account our concerns. So to repeat in a nutshell, I support the policy, as will be apparent in a minute, but I expect India to recognize that there is reciprocity involved in this new relationship. And without reciprocity, India will get very little help from the Congress. Mr. Chairman, I want to commend you for holding this hearing today on what may be the most momentous change in US-India relations since India's independence, and which may have profound implications for the entire Asian region and beyond. I applaud and strongly support the administration's intention, as expressed in the July 18 joint statement, to establish a closer global partnership with India to promote stability, democracy, prosperity, and peace throughout the world. The joint initiatives in increasing trade and economic development, promotion of bilateral cooperation in high technology and space research, combating HIV/AIDS globally, and a closer security relationship are all objectives that should be welcomed by every member of this body. Mr. Chairman, a truly reciprocal political and security partnership with the world's largest democracy and the traditional leader of what was formerly known as the non-aligned movement, could be revolutionary in its significance, especially in the furtherance of democracy and the fight against terrorism. India is a natural ally of the United States, and both our countries have faced deadly terrorist attacks on our political institutions from proponents of extremist violence. As the preeminent state in the region, India deserves the world's respect and our fullest attention. For these reasons, Mr. Chairman, I have repeatedly and publicly called for India to take its rightful place as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. The initiative that has garnered the most public attention, however, is the visionary American proposal to greatly expand nuclear research, nuclear power, and non-proliferation cooperation with New Delhi. This change will promote a greater dialogue between the US and India on preventing the spread of sensitive nuclear technology and materials to other countries or even terrorist groups. As we have seen, private and stateless nuclear black market networks can arise that tap the technological and production resources and expertise of many states clandestinely to satisfy the nuclear weapons aspirations of countries like North Korea and Iran. Advanced nuclear states like India must be ever more vigilant to prevent illicit exports of such material and technology. The commitments made by Prime Minister Singh in the July 18th joint statement in this regard are very encouraging. Acceptance of a safeguard arrangement for India's non-military facilities is likewise a step forward. Expanded nuclear cooperation will also allow greater scientific exchange and collaboration with US nuclear scientists and engineers. This will foster relationships that will be to the benefit of both countries in physics and medical research, as well as improving the safety and efficiency of Indian nuclear reactors and facilities. But, as with any major policy change, the administration's new direction poses a set of issues that must be fully understood and fully explored before we move forward. By law, policy, and practice, the United States has resisted engaging in significant nuclear cooperation with any state that has not agreed to permit international safeguards and inspections on all its nuclear activities and facilities, known as full-scope safeguards. Through strenuous diplomatic efforts, the United States was able to make these safeguards an integral part of the export guidelines for multilateral nuclear supplier group. This was necessary to prevent the diversion of nuclear material from peaceful power and research facilities to use in the production of nuclear weapons. The administration's expansion of nuclear cooperation with India represents a sweeping change to this long-standing policy, and it is now time to flesh out the details of the agreement. At a committee briefing in late July, administration officials had few answers about just what the policy meant for US and international non-proliferation and export policies, what type of cooperation both sides envision, and how it will be implemented. They did not know what exports would be allowed under the new policy, what specific steps India would take to improve its own non-proliferation behavior and controls, or what changes would be required, if any, to long-standing US non-proliferation law. It was also not clear whether and to what extent India will support U.S. policies worldwide. And I wish to repeat this, because this to me is the crux of the matter. If we are turning ourselves into a pretzel to accommodate India, I want to be damn sure that India is mindful of U.S. policies in critical areas, such as U.S. policy towards Iran. India cannot pursue a policy vis-à-vis Iran which takes no account of U.S. foreign policy objectives. It was also not clear whether and to what extent India will support U.S. policies worldwide, and especially in international organizations and elsewhere. I am particularly concerned over recent remarks by the Indian Foreign Minister that India will not support the U.S. drive to refer Iran's nuclear weapons effort to the UN Security Council. This position is contrary to what we understood the administration was trying to achieve in forging this arrangement. I want the administration to hear clearly from this committee. New Delhi must understand how important their cooperation and support is to U.S. initiatives to counter the nuclear threat from Iran. That includes supporting our efforts to refer Iran's 18 years of violations of the NPT to the UN Security Council. Anything less than full support will imperil the expansion of U.S. nuclear and security cooperation with New Delhi. It is reportedly intent of the administration to assist India in becoming a great power. But with great power comes great responsibility. India must decide where it will stand, with the Ayatollahs of terror in Tehran or with the United States. It is also important, if India is to assume truly the status of a great power, that it move beyond the confines of South Asia and support efforts to establish stability and democracy elsewhere, for example, in Iraq. I look forward with great interest to the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lantos, for a very important statement. We will now recognize members who seek recognition for 1-minute statements. You each will have 5 minutes if we reach you in the time available for this hearing. But we would try this as an experiment to give members 1 minute for an opening statement if they choose. There's no law requiring the statement, however. Mr. Leach.
Well, first, I'd like unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just be very brief. I don't know any member of Congress that doesn't want to have a warming of relations with the government of India. This is a time that it's extremely appropriate. I also don't know many members of Congress that were pushing for the precise commitment that the administration has made. Many members, as reflected in Mr. Lantos' statement, support India joining the Security Council. This administration, I thought, was going to announce that with the visit of the Prime Minister. Instead, you chose an initiative for which you may not be able to deliver. And this should be clearly understood, because the initiative you've chosen is one that requires an act of Congress. And you chose to make this initiative without, to my knowledge, any serious prior consultation with the Congress. And now you're coming before us to ask us to advance what you have committed. I'm open-minded to considering it, but having just returned from North Korea, I will tell you, a lot of people in the world care about the NPT. We care about the NPT vis-a-vis North Korea. They raised with us initiatives because we apparently don't care about the NPT in other circumstances.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Berman. Mr. Burton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me say that I would like to associate my remarks with yours and that of Mr. Lantos. I think they were very well stated. As one who has taken issue with a lot of the things that India has done in the past, I want to say that I'm optimistic about our future relations with India. When President Musharraf and the Prime Minister Singh of India started talking about working out an agreement with Kashmir and border disputes, that was the first step that's been taken in that direction in a long, long time. And it reduces the threat of a war between the two countries, both of whom have nuclear capability. So while we have a lot of things to work through, and I have a lot of the concerns my colleagues have talked about, I'm more optimistic than I've been in the past about our relations with India. I hope they continue to get better. And I am anxious to work with my colleagues to make sure that that happens. And I think I got it done within a minute, didn't I, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, you did.
Which is rare, don't you think?
You get a gold star.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with your remarks, that of Mr. Leach, and in the strongest possible terms with the remarks of Mr. Lantos, especially his obiter dictum, the cautionary note that he sounded. And I guess that's because, as the chairman of the Caucus on India and Indian Americans and one of India's strongest supporters, I think it's important to let all say that friends do not let friends play with fire. By any measure, the joint statement that was issued in July during Prime Minister Singh's visit to Washington is an historic one and a huge success for both nations. In my view, the Prime Minister achieved nothing less than the acceptance by the U.S. of India as a nuclear power and won the commitment of the U.S. to bring the rest of the international community to that view. It's dramatic change in U.S. non-proliferation policy, but the fact of the matter is that it makes sense for the U.S. to welcome India as one of the leading states with advanced nuclear technology. Over the past 30 years, India has demonstrated not only a successful mastery of a complicated technology, but the ability to ensure that such technology does not get transferred into the wrong hands. It is here, Mr. Chairman, that I think opponents of the announced agreement get it wrong. India is not a proliferation risk in the sense that it would share its own technology with rogue states or with terrorists. Simply because India...
Gentleman's time has expired.
I ask unanimous consent to put the rest of my remarks in the
Without
record.
objection, so ordered. And Ms. Ross Leighton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Do I get a gold star, Mr. Chairman?
A silver star.
It's an improvement, I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to underscore my strong support for an expansion and strengthening of bilateral relations between the United States and our ally, the world's largest democracy, India. And the 8 initiatives that constitute the building blocks for this global partnerships are important ones. And while I understand the geopolitical and geostrategic considerations that led to President Bush's announcement during Prime Minister Singh's visit, we must be careful not to view this partnership in a vacuum. It is critical that we consider the far-reaching implications of a full nuclear cooperation with India and how a de facto recognition of India as a nuclear weapon state would undermine U.S. non-proliferation policy and potentially create a negative and damaging domino effect. And of most important concern to me is how it would impact U.S. efforts to prevent rogue states such as Iran, as Mr. Lantos pointed out and as our chairman has pointed out, from achieving nuclear status. So a lot needs to be discussed before Congress can decide whether to and how to alter safeguards and restrictions in existing legislation. And this India-Iran partnership is of true concern to this committee, and I hope that that message gets passed on. Thank you.
Mr. Schiff.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be very brief as well. It seems to me that in this issue we have the collision of two profound interests of the United States. One, the deepening and strengthening of the relationship with India, and the other, a desire to prevent, discourage the proliferation of nuclear technology and address the greatest threat we face, that of nuclear terrorism. And plainly, this agreement has very strong pros and very strong cons. I have an open mind on it. It seems to me, in some respects, this will make our non-proliferation task more difficult, a difficult job as it is. There have been difficult arguments for us to make, for example, about potential expansion of U.S. nuclear weapons when we are urging others to adhere to the NPT. I see a similar difficulty in urging nations to either join or stay in the NPT when other nations are allowed to enjoy the benefits of nuclear technology without being in the NPT. So these are some real tough issues that have been placed before us. I have an open mind on them, and I very much look forward to the hearing, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Royce.
Thank you, Chairman Hyde. I thank you for holding this important hearing. And my hope is that this is only the first hearing that we hold in this committee on this very complex and critically important issue. Undoubtedly, the civilian nuclear cooperation agreement we're looking at here furthers what has been our improving and important relationship with India. In assessing this agreement, it seems to me the goal of curbing nuclear proliferation should trump other factors. I think that proliferation is a great threat to our nation, and today this committee begins its consideration of whether the cause of non-proliferation is advanced by this proposed change in our India policy and our non-proliferation policy. So I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for hopefully the first of several hearings on this subject.
Mr. Chandler. Thank you. Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you very much, and let me note that what we are seeing and hearing today is yet another example of the visionary leadership that this committee has had under the direction of Mr. Hyde and Mr. Lantos. This is bipartisan visionary leadership at its best. And yes, Mr. Leach is correct in giving us the admonition that Congress has to play a role, and perhaps we could have had a little bit more interaction on this issue. But the fact is, we're launching the congressional role today in reestablishing a new policy for India, which is, of course, one of the most important changes in direction, in foreign policy direction, probably in my lifetime. We're breaking free of the old Cold War alliances, and India will play such a significant role that I commend the leadership of this committee and commend the President for moving forward and trying to establish this new direction that will change not only our relations, but the whole balance of the world. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Hyde, Mr. Lantos.
Mr. Crowley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, I will be brief. I have no choice. But I will not go on in too much detail except to say that I associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Lantos as well in much regard. And I, too, have an open mind about this process as we move forward. Since I only have less than a minute, I just want to take this opportunity, and I'll go into more detail when I have my 5 minutes, if I get that chance, to thank the government of India for its outreach after our recent natural disaster of Katrina, one of the first nations to reach out to the United States in a substantial way with aid and assistance, a country that's known its own share of natural disasters. So I want to publicly thank them as well, and look forward to this testimony today. Thank you.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your leadership, and it's exciting to be here today with our guest and to recognize the global partnership we have with India. I've been very grateful to be the co-chair of the India Caucus, and I've been succeeded by Ileana Ross-Leighton, and I had the terrific privilege of following Ed Royce in that position and working with Congressman Joe Crowley. And indeed, I have seen the fruition of the good relationship between India and the United States in the significant role of Indian Americans serving in our society. It's greatly appreciated. Look forward to the testimony today.
Ms. McCollum.
Mr. Chair, I'm just interested to hear the testimony to explain why we are not following through with our commitment to the Non-Proliferation Treaty in regards to India. In other words, why we're breaking a treaty that we've signed on to. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Poe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. India certainly is an important ally to the United States in Southeast Asia. And it is vital that the United States, however, does not undermine 30 years of U.S. nonproliferation by turning a blind eye to India's nuclear proliferation. I'm concerned that if the United States indiscriminately gives India a pass regarding the rules of nuclear proliferation, then other nations such as their Ukraine, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, will question their signing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and will expect the same benefits as India. You know, as they say in the South, what is good for the gander is certainly good for the goose. And furthermore, we cannot turn a blind eye to those international reports that suggest India is one of the main allies in the brutal regime in supporting of Burma. So I look forward to testimony regarding both of these issues regarding human rights and the non-proliferation philosophy that the United States has. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Delahunt.
No, I wouldn't be so presumptuous.
Mr. Tancredo. Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I just want to echo the sentiments of Mr. Crowley and thank the India government for their offer of assistance as well in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. The United States, I think, has been very generous in its outreach to other countries in a time of need, and it's heartwarming to see other countries return that favor now.
Mr. Boozman. Mr. Flake. Ambassador R. Nicholas Burns was Senate confirmed as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the Department of State's third-ranking official, on March 17, 2005. As a career senior Foreign Service officer, he served our nation in countries all over the world. We thank you for joining us today, Mr. Ambassador, and we look forward to your testimony. Robert Joseph serves as the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. He's the principal state officer for non- and counter-proliferation matters, as well as for arms control, arms transfers, regional security and defense relations, and security assistance. Dr. Joseph, we're grateful that you're here to shed light on the issues we have before us at this important hearing. Ambassador Burns, if you could proceed with a 5-minute summary of your prepared testimony, your entire statement will be made a part of the record. And when Dr. Joseph is through, if you gentlemen will submit to questions, we'll try to be trenchant. Mr. Burns, Ambassador Burns.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting Bob Joseph and I here today, and thank you to Mr. Lantos and all the members who are with us. I've been asked by Secretary Rice just to say a few words about the international response to the hurricane in the southern part of our country. I'll do that very briefly, and I would say that Secretary Rice would like to make the State Department available to all members who would want to be briefed about what foreign governments are doing in support of our people in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. 100 governments and 11 international organizations have offered support to the United States, and the President and Secretary of State have decided that in principle we ought to be receptive to agreeing to permit all of those offers of assistance to come forward. We are working now on a day-to-day basis with FEMA, with other parts of the government, to see which of those offers can be most useful to the people who've been affected so tragically by the hurricane. And I just wanted to brief the members that we have opened our doors to foreign assistance, and we're very grateful for the statements made today in support of what the Indian government has done. The Indian government has offered us material supplies, tents and blankets and food, and they've also offered a financial donation to the American Red Cross. I can also tell you that we have set up a staging point at Little Rock, Arkansas, for foreign planes to arrive, and over the last 2 days we've had planes arrive from France and from Britain, from Russia, and from China, and more of those will arrive over the next few days. And we're working as closely as we possibly can with FEMA and the other agencies to make sure that we get needed assistance to the affected people as quickly as possible. So there's a lot more that I can say. Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to respond to questions from members on this particular issue. And Secretary Rice has directed that we make ourselves available to the Congress at any point over the next couple of days and weeks to brief you in detail by region or by country. Mr. Chairman, I should also say that it was actually very valuable for us, I think, to hear the opening comments of the members today, and we hear your message. And I just want to assure you that we understand the seriousness of Congress's role in looking at the agreements we've made with the government of India, particularly in the civilian nuclear energy agreement. This is the first formal hearing that we've been invited to attend, but Bob and I and other members of the administration are very willing to submit ourselves to private conversations, further hearings, so that we can take your advice and counsel and answer the questions that many of you have. As you know, Mr. Chairman, Secretary Rice has also agreed to brief this committee as well as the Senate on our policy towards South Asia, as well as specifically what we've committed to do with the Indian government on a reciprocal basis. You can be assured, Mr. Lantos, and she'll be happy to schedule that with you, Mr. Chairman, at a mutually convenient time. I also want to say, in just beginning this briefing from our side, Mr. Lantos, that we have heard what you said and the other members have said about Iran. It just so happens that Undersecretary Joseph and I are the two officials in the State Department responsible for working on the problem of Iran's nuclear ambitions. And both of us do that on a daily basis. And we share your concerns about what Iran has done. It's broken the Paris Agreement with the EU3, with Britain, France, and Germany. It has now unilaterally gone ahead to resume uranium conversion. It is in violation of its international agreements, particularly with the IAEA. And we are working with those allies, with India, with China and Russia and other countries, to see if we can have a successful international effort through the IAEA and perhaps the UN Security Council to convince Iran to come back to its senses and return to negotiations with the Europeans. And I think we'd be happy to answer any questions that members have on that subject as well. And thank you for raising it. And we share many of the concerns, Mr. Lantos, that you and others have raised today. Mr. Chairman, I have submitted a statement for the record. I will not read that statement, but I thought what I should do is just share a few thoughts that would respond to some of the questions that have already been asked, and we'll be glad to answer your questions. You know that President Bush has made a fundamental judgment that our relations with India will be central to our future policy in South Asia and around the world. After 9/11, we began a rapid buildup of our relations with Pakistan and with Afghanistan, and we remain committed to our new relations with both of those countries. Our desire to improve relations with India is in part a response to the huge security challenges that were unleashed by the attack on our country on September 11th of 2001. But our desire to form a new strategic relationship with India actually goes beyond that event. India is a rising global power, as some of you have mentioned. Within the first quarter of this century, it is likely to be numbered among the world's 5 largest economies. It will soon be the world's most populous nation. It has a demographic structure that bequeaths it a huge, skilled, and youthful workforce. And it will continue to possess an ever larger and stronger military force that is going to be an important factor for stability in South Asia and around the world. And above all else, India shares many of our values. It is a democracy. It is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multilingual country. We know what kind of a country India will be 25 years from now, because the democratic structure of that country has proven itself over the last 50 years. And it is in our national interest to develop a strong, forward-looking relationship with the world's largest democracy, because that will serve us in the region and it will serve our larger interests around the world. We consider India now to be one of our most important and strongest partners around the world. We do so because as we look around the world, we know that we have to win the war on terrorism and that India has to be part of that struggle. We know that we have to prevent the spread of weapons of mass destruction. We know that we have to ensure peace and stability both in South and East Asia and in the Pacific region. We need to protect trade routes and sea lines of communication. And as President Bush has said in his inaugural address, we need to propose the spread of democracy and work towards it around the world. India is a natural partner in all of those ventures, in achieving all of those objectives of American foreign policy, and it is the right partner for us to be working with on a renewed basis. And that was, in essence, the sum of what President Bush tried to achieve with Prime Minister Singh in their summit meeting on July 18th. We did announce the new agreement on civilian nuclear cooperation, and Bob and I will be going into some detail on that in response to your questions. But we went beyond that. President Bush and Prime Minister Singh actually framed a new relationship that is much broader and much deeper than at any time since 1947, when India became an independent country. And as all of you know, we've had a somewhat rocky relationship with India throughout the Cold War, when India considered itself part of the non-aligned movement. That has very much changed. India sees the United States for the first time in 60 years as a strategic partner, and we view India in the same fashion. During the visit of the Prime Minister, we announced several initiatives. One was to expand our economic relationship, and this, we hope, will mean further investment and trade and further jobs for Americans, as well as economic growth as India continues to rise as an economic power in the world. We also announced an energy and environment dialogue, which will be run by Secretary Bodman, the Secretary of Energy. And this is intended to help India meet the massive requirements that it has for energy in the future, and to do so on a clean and sustainable basis. And one of the reasons that we've turned to a civil nuclear energy deal is because it will have consequences, positive consequences, we hope, for global warming. Because India is a massive consumer of coal. 51% of its energy needs come from coal, and the Indians would like to change that mix towards cleaner technology in the nuclear, in terms of peaceful nuclear energy. We also announced as part of this visit a U.S.-India joint venture to support democracy around the world. Our two countries were the first two countries to contribute to the new UN Fund for Democracy, and you'll see that next week when President Bush and Prime Minister Singh meet together in a ceremony in New York to kick off that venture. President Bush and the Prime Minister announced a joint venture, a joint agreement on HIV/AIDS prevention, which is a growing problem within India. But the Indians also want to help us try to alleviate HIV/AIDS as a pandemic in Africa and other parts of the developing world, not just in their own country. We actually negotiated an agreement on disaster assistance. You'll remember that when the tsunami was unleashed last December, there were 4 countries that took the lead in providing assistance: India, the United States, Japan, and Australia. And those 4 countries were able to provide the lion's share of the immediate assistance to the countries of Southeast Asia. And now India, as several members have said, has come forward to assist us with material supplies and with a financial donation, and we're very grateful for that. We announced an agreement on science and technology, which is a very important part of what both of our countries do well in the private sector and in terms of our academic institutions. We announced an agreement on space cooperation, where we'll be working together on space exploration, on satellite navigation and launch, and we had an agreement in agriculture as well. So I just list those because we are establishing a much broader relationship than we've had at any time over the last 60 years. I know that members are particularly interested in the issue of our civilian nuclear cooperation. Let me just close with a few thoughts on that. I know Undersecretary Joseph, who is our department official responsible for nonproliferation, will want to go into deeper detail. This is a major presidential initiative. It is one that seeks to bring about full civil nuclear energy cooperation between the United States and India. I had the privilege of negotiating this agreement for the United States, for the President and Secretary of State. I believe it's a good agreement. It is a sound agreement, and it will have the effect of progressively integrating India into the global nonproliferation order. We sought the agreement because India's nuclear weapons program and its status outside the nonproliferation regime has proven to be a long-standing stumbling block to enhance U.S.-India relations, as well as the problem of global nonproliferation regimes. The agreement is intended to deepen our bilateral work in this area, to address India's energy needs, and above all, to advance the international effort on nonproliferation. And Mr. Chairman, many do not realize that India is one of the few developing countries that possesses full competency over all aspects of the nuclear fuel cycle, and is in fact pursuing a variety of advanced nuclear technologies, and yet it remains, as it has since 1967, outside the global regime. India has demonstrated a strong commitment to protection of fissile materials and nuclear technology, and we believe it's now time to end the isolation of India and to integrate it into nonproliferation norms. And for the very first time since the start of the Indian nuclear program, as we review the agreement that was made, and that I think all of you have, India has committed to a series of steps that will bring it into compliance with the norms and practices of the non-proliferation regime. We do not believe that would have been possible had we not negotiated this agreement, had we not chosen to engage India in this issue. And for me, that is the most compelling reason why this is a good agreement on a realistic basis for the United States. But we certainly understand, Mr. Chairman, and I'll close on this point, that we have made a commitment on a reciprocal basis. And if you look at our joint statement, and Under Secretary Joseph's and my testimony, the written testimony explains what India has committed to do, we know that the Congress cannot act to change U.S. law or modify it or we can't seek a waiver from existing legislation until India begins to show us that it is moving to meet its commitments. I'll be meeting with the Indian Foreign Secretary in New York next week to begin the process of achieving a mutual schedule so that as we begin to move to meet on our reciprocal basis, the Indians do as well. And I think one of the great advantages of this hearing would be to hear from members of the House how you would suggest that we proceed on that basis. And we'll also want to consult with you on exactly how we proceed in gaining the support from the Congress and action of the Congress to bring this agreement into being. But I certainly agree with statements by many of the members today that this is reciprocal, that we need to see movement by the government of India, and above all, we need the support and the active agreement of both houses of Congress. And so we look forward to working with you over many months ahead. This is going to be a very detailed, very challenging process, but we are convinced it's in our best national interest. Thank you very much.
Dr. Joseph.
Mr. Chairman, Congressman Lantos, other distinguished members of the committee, it's a pleasure for me to be here today. I also will not read my testimony, but rather try to make 5 points by way of introduction that respond to some of the issues that you have raised, as well as the concerns that have been expressed with regard to non-proliferation. First, with the joint statement, India has agreed to take on important non-proliferation commitments that will bring it into the mainstream of the international nuclear non-proliferation community. This is a positive step for India, and it's a positive step for us. While more can and will be done, India's implementation of its commitments will, on balance, enhance the global non-proliferation efforts. And we believe the global non-proliferation regime will be strengthened as a result. In the joint statement, India has agreed to a number of very significant steps. It will identify and separate civilian and military nuclear facilities and programs, and file a declaration with the International Atomic Energy Agency regarding its civilian facilities. It will also place its civilian facilities under IAEA safeguards. It will sign and adhere to an additional protocol with respect to those civilian facilities. It will continue its unilateral moratorium on testing and work for the conclusion of a fissile material cutoff treaty. It will refrain from the transfer of enrichment and reprocessing technologies to states that don't possess that capability and support efforts to limit their spread. And India will also secure missile and nuclear materials and technologies through comprehensive export control legislation and adherence to both the MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, and the NSG, the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Each of these activities will strengthen the global regime. Together, we believe they move India much closer into conformity with international non-proliferation standards and practices. Second, while we are determined to succeed, the administration understands the challenges we face in achieving the goals we have set with India. For example, ensuring that India's separation of civil and military facilities is both credible and defensible from a non-proliferation perspective. Achieving nuclear suppliers group support for the effort without undercutting the effectiveness of this valuable non-proliferation tool. and of course working with you to revise current provisions of U.S. law to enable full cooperation on the civil nuclear side. We understand that to implement effectively the steps that have been agreed in the joint statement, we will need the active support of Congress and that of our international partners. We expect, and we have told the Indian government, that India's follow-through on its commitments will prove key enablers for our collective action. Third, I would note that many, though clearly not all, of our international partners have recognized the need to treat India differently, and some have indicated their full support for this initiative. The Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Dr. Alberti, personally welcomed India's decision to place its civil nuclear facilities under IAEA safeguards and to implement the additional protocol. Some countries have been critical. Many have understandably questioned how this initiative comports with the NPT and our efforts to combat proliferation. Others have asked why a cap on India's production of fissile material for weapons was not part of the deal. These are important questions, and let me just try to address them. The United States does not and will not support India's nuclear weapons program. Our initiative with India does not recognize India as an NPT nuclear weapon state, and we will not seek to renegotiate the NPT.
Mr. Secretary, if you'd just pause for a moment. That is a previous question and a vote on a rule. I intend to stay here and have the testimony continue. So those of you who wish could go over and vote now and get back as soon as possible so that you can be present and ask some questions. But I would recommend a hasty departure and an even hastier return. And meanwhile, some of us will stay and the witnesses can continue their testimony. Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Please continue.
Let me assure you that we will fully uphold all of our obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But we also recognize that India is a special case, and we see a clear need to come to terms with it. India was never a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In fact, India has been very hostile toward the treaty for many years. With its decision to take the steps announced in the joint statement, India will now take on new non-proliferation responsibilities, which strengthen the global non-proliferation efforts and serve the fundamental purpose of the NPT. In this context, we remain committed to achieving Indian curtailment of fissile material production, and we have strongly encouraged a move in this direction. We stand willing to explore options that might serve this objective, but we will not insist on it for purposes of the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Initiative. But even absent such a cap, the initiative, in our view, represents a net gain for nonproliferation. It is a win for our strategic relationship. It is a win for energy security, and we believe a win for nonproliferation. Fourth, with respect to next steps, we seek your active support and that of our international partners. On the domestic front, we recognize that the pace and the scope of expanded nuclear civil cooperation with India requires close consultations between the executive and legislative branches. In our own ongoing review of current U.S. law, we have identified a number of options for modifying and/or waiving provisions of the Atomic Energy Act that currently prohibit the United States from engaging in full cooperation with India. With respect to our international partners, we have already begun consultations with NSG members, and we look forward to further discussions at the October meeting. Finally, I think it's useful to put the policy on India in the broader context of the President's non- and counterproliferation policies. One element of our approach as an administration has been the recognition that there is no viable cookie-cutter approach to countering proliferation. We need to have tailored approaches that solve real-world problems. From the outset of his first term, the President established non- and counterproliferation as top national security priorities. He put in place the first comprehensive strategy at the national level for combating this preeminent threat to our security. and he embarked on changing how we as a nation and how the international community more broadly design and expand our collective efforts to defend against this dangerous and complex threat. Recognizing that traditional nonproliferation measures were essential but no longer sufficient, the President has put in place new concepts and new capabilities for countering WMD proliferation by hostile states and terrorists. For example, he increased our national resources and greatly leveraged the resources of the G8 countries to bolster non-Lugar type nonproliferation assistance programs, especially in the context of the global partnership. He launched the Proliferation Security Initiative to disrupt the trade in proliferation-related materials. And he initiated the effort resulting in the unanimous adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1540 that requires all states to enact legislation criminalizing proliferation activities under their jurisdiction. These efforts in what we call effective multilateralism, coupled with the strengthening of our own counterproliferation capabilities, have produced concrete successes such as the unraveling of the AQ-CON network and the decision by the Libyan government to abandon its nuclear, chemical, and longer-range missile programs. Such efforts also demonstrate the need to be creative and to adjust our approaches to take into account the conditions that exist so that we can better achieve our nonproliferation objectives. In sum, the President's initiative is tailored to India's clear and growing energy needs, but it is also a pragmatic and effective response to the proliferation threats we face as a nation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Secretary Joseph. Both of your statements declare that the administration plans to work with the Congress to implement the legislation needed to fulfill the obligations we've made to the Indian government. Are you prepared today to commit to working with this committee, which, as you are aware, is the responsible authorizing committee for the necessary legislation, and to assure us today that the administration will not seek an alternative route such as attaching this to an appropriations bill? And am I putting you both in a spot?
Mr. Chairman, that's a fair question, and so we'll try to give you a straight answer. We have made a commitment, and you and I have had the opportunity to speak privately, that we will come before your committee as many times as you would like us to, and to meet privately with members as much as that is necessary so that we can hopefully convince the Congress that this is the right step for the United States. And as you know, and as I said before, Secretary Rice is also committed to come up and talk about this agreement, our relationship with India, and our policy towards South Asia as a whole, and I just spoke with her again about that this morning. So I think that what we'd like to do is initiate, and we are initiating today, a discussion with the Congress, and we'd like to seek your advice. We have thought about the best legislative vehicle to achieve the end that we would like to see, but frankly, rather than commit to a specific vehicle this morning, we felt it better to seek your advice and talk to you and talk to members of the Senate who are interested, and then come to an agreement on the best way forward. There are many ways that we could achieve this, but we really are in your hands in part as to how best you think it will be to go forward. We'll have our own ideas, but we'd like to continue that discussion with you.
Well, I'm certainly encouraged by the tone of your remarks, and we shall take you up on the availability that you're pledging to us, and we hope that does involve consultation. A number of observers have pointed out that it's going to be very hard to get the Nuclear Suppliers Group to amend its guidelines to allow the kinds of nuclear transfers to India that you're proposing. Nuclear Supply Group rules require unanimity within the group before any such amendment can be adopted, and it appears likely that a number of NSG members will resist doing this. The NPT non-proliferation treaty purists like Sweden and New Zealand will not be happy. Some of the NAM countries that joined the NPT reluctantly, such as South Africa and Brazil, can be expected to object. And China may well say that it will not agree to such an amendment unless Pakistan is granted the same exception to the NSG guidelines. Many of us are strong supporters of the NSG and would not want to see it weakened or destroyed over the issue. Accordingly, I was hoping you can assure us today, no matter what else happens, the administration will continue to abide by NSG guidelines, and if you are unable to gain consensus within the NSG for the amendment you need, you will not implement the new India policy in violation of NSG guidelines. Can you give us that assurance?
Mr. Chairman, we can certainly assure you that we intend to take no action that would undercut the effectiveness of the NSG. It is a very important non-proliferation tool. Our intention is not to change either the consensus procedure of the NSG or to even change the NSG commitment to full-scope safeguards as a condition of supply. Rather, what we seek is to adopt an exception or a set of criteria that would allow, in the context of India taking the actions that I have described on the non-proliferation side, that would allow full cooperation with India. We will work with all of the NSG members. It's not going to be an easy task, but we believe we have a very strong argument to make, and an argument that is persuasive in that taking this action with India in exchange for the Indian commitments will strengthen the purpose of the NPT and strengthen the NSG in that context.
Mr. Wexler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Comes as no surprise, but I think both of your gentlemen's statements were excellent. I think they're very persuasive statements of the administration's decision and policy. I speak as someone who strongly supports the decision that the administration has reached. I think the case that you lay out, both of you, that the policy and the decision, if done properly, is a win-win for India and America. It's a win-win for our strategic relationship, and it's also a win for the non-proliferation infrastructure and goals of both our country and the international agreements that are set up to implement non-proliferation. There's one aspect of this that troubles me, and I'd be curious if you could respond. Here we are taking this enormous step with India as well, I believe, and you believe, and the administration believes we ought to. And yet, if I understand it correctly, the most troubling aspect of non-proliferation in the world, I think all Americans would agree, is occurring today in Iran. And if I understand it correctly with respect to the statement or policy of India as it was enunciated when the Indian foreign minister was in Iran, was that India seems to be opposed to our policy relative to the nuclear ambitions of Iran. If my understanding is correct regarding India's position relative to our policy regarding Iran and potentially the referral of that scenario to the UN and the Security Council, how is it that we embark on such an aggressive policy, positive policy with India, and at the same time, possibly, India be opposed to what seem to be our goals regarding Iran? Is it improper to couple the two? Should we expect India to support our objectives? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Congressman Wexler, Mr. Lantos and others raised this issue with us this morning. I think it's a fair question. I believe, as I understand India's position on Iran, India does not wish Iran to become a nuclear weapon state. And I believe the Indian government has gone on the record to say that. We have had, over the last several weeks, and specifically the last few days, had a series of conversations with the Indian government about the best way to achieve that end, to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons state. And Undersecretary Joseph and I work very closely together on the effort to try to convince the IAEA Board of Governors to agree on September 19th to refer Iran to the UN Security Council. Our wish, working with the Europeans, with the Chinese, with the Russians, with the Indians, with South Africans and others, is to convince Iran that there has to be a diplomatic solution to the problem, and they have to return to negotiations, and they have to eliminate the possibility that they'll be engaged in any process, nuclear energy fuel cycle process. Our position is they should shut down all those activities, including uranium conversion. We continue to discuss this with the Indian government. I can't speak for the Indian government, but I can say that this is an issue where we intend to have further discussions with them next week at the UN General Assembly in New York. I know that Secretary Rice will be raising this with the Indian Foreign Minister. I will be doing so with the Indian Foreign Secretary. And it's our strong hope that we can achieve with India, with Russia and China and the other countries, an agreement that all of us have to put some pressure on the Iranian government to convince it to come back to the negotiations with the Europeans.
Let me just add that at last month's meeting of the board of the IAEA, India did join in the resolution on Iran, which expressed serious concerns about Iranian activities, specifically the resumption of work at its conversion facility at Isfahan, and also called on Iran to stop that activity and to basically resuspend the measures that it had taken and return to the negotiations with the EU3. Since then, there have been a number of disconcerting statements made not only by India but by a number of other governments, some of which Undersecretary Burns has identified, others that Congressman Lantos identified. We have our task ahead of us. It is, it seems to me, critically important for the not only vitality of the regime, but the very legitimacy of the nuclear nonproliferation regime, that we move this forward to the Security Council, this being the issue of Iranian noncompliance with its safeguards obligations, as well as breaking the Paris Agreement with the EU3. We have a strong case, but we have our work cut out for us. I know our European partners are working hard to achieve the same objective. We're supporting them in that effort. But again, it's an uphill battle for us, but we are fully engaged, as Undersecretary Burns says, in winning that battle.
Thank you.
I might parenthetically state that after the votes on the floor are completed today, all of the votes, Mr. Lantos, Mr. Royce, Mr. Payne, and myself are headed to New York to meet with Ambassador Bolton and the Secretary General Kofi Annan. The subject matter is reform of the UN, which is somewhat distant from our subject matter now, but I understand at this point there's little agreement among the key players on the wide array of reform issues that are critical to the United States: management reform, revision of the Human Rights Commission, and many others having to do with transparency and management. I mention this because the objections to the language in the so-called outcome document are coming from the NAM, of which India is seen historically as a leader. I know that I will look closely at the role that India plays in this process as one of the first indicators of India's closer relationship with the United States and our objective of reforming the UN and restoring that institution's credibility. So it's not entirely removed from the subject matter of our hearing today. Ambassador Burns, in your July 19th press briefing, you described the agreement as verifiable. What aspects of this agreement will be verified?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. May I just make a comment on your first question or your comment on UN reform?
Surely.
Because obviously we all thank you for the leading role you've played in the Congress in trying to convince the United Nations that it needs to reform itself, and we very much support the trip that you're making tomorrow.
However disruptive my efforts were.
Your efforts concentrated our minds, Mr. Chairman, as they did many other minds around the world.
It's my sincere belief the only way to get their attention is to talk about our payment of dues, which are considerable. And as the major dues payer, we ought to have some voice in the reforms. And so I don't want to say that my effort was simply to get their attention, but I hope it's a byproduct of we'll know more after tomorrow.
I think we strongly support the trip that you're making, you and the other members, tomorrow, and we do believe that this issue of reform, your bill, the Gingrich-Mitchell report, the hearings held by Senator Lugar on the Senate side, they've all focused our attention and the attention of the UN on reform. As you know, we strongly support what the Congress is suggesting, and that is that there be significant reform of the UN's management, budget, and administrative structure in the Secretariat. The oil for food revelations of the past few weeks and yesterday are testimony to the fact that there has to be progress. And Ambassador Bolton has been working with 190 other ambassadors to produce a summit document for next week's summit, which our president will attend, that would press for those reforms, that would press for a replacement of the Human Rights Commission, which we, and I know you believe, is discredited, with a new Human Rights Council that will actually promote democracy and not have violators of democracy sit in judgment of the rest of us, that we will support the creation of a peace-building commission, a convention on terrorism, and an agreement that we should all work together to further development and alleviate poverty and fight HIV/AIDS. I can give you an initial report card. Ambassador Bolton and his colleagues have made, I think, a fair amount of progress on the development issues. And contrary to some of the erroneous press reports of last week, the United States has been leading in a very positive way on the development side. And last night they achieved an initial agreement on what we all should be doing around the world to promote assistance to the developing world and to the poorer people of the world. We have not yet reached agreement on the management budget side, and I hope that during your trip tomorrow, this might be a centerpiece of what you discuss with Secretary General Kofi Annan and others. And so we look upon your trip as very positive, and it comes before the President's visit of the 13th and 14th, and we do hope to produce, with 190 other countries, this outcome document that will represent the will of the world to reform the UN. And we very much respect the effort that you've put into it, Mr. Chairman. As you know very well, we've been public about this. We do not support a mandatory withholding of American contributions, but we support your commitment to reform and want to work with you on that basis. And Mr. Chairman, you asked me a specific question about India. I did say in my July 19th press conference that the agreement would be verifiable. We have a completely transparent relationship with India. And I told the Indian negotiators while we were working on this agreement that the only way it could be implemented is if we were transparent in the steps that the United States took to implement the agreement, and that we had visibility into what the Indian government is doing. So as they begin to separate their civil and military nuclear facilities, which is going to be the heart of this agreement, the United States government, the United States Congress are going to have to be able to see it happen and understand what is happening and agree on what is happening. And so there'll be both transparency and verifiability. It's the only possible way, I think, for us to proceed on an agreement that is as complex as this one is.
I might add again parenthetically that in view of oil for food, we're going to take a lively interest in the project of rebuilding the UN structure, the contracting of that. It seems to me something that will require a close look, and we're all for it, but we think it will deserve.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that. We actually agree with you. You know, we have been heading down the road towards a multi-billion-dollar U.S. government loan to the United Nations to be able to rebuild the UN complex. And there were some Senate hearings held on this issue, and as a result of the Senate hearings, we've agreed with members of the Senate that we ought to take a look at this over 30 to 60 days to make sure that the United Nations is devising the right approach and the most cost-effective approach, because, of course, some of the money on a lending basis will come from the United States government. And so I expect that we'll be ready to come back to you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the Senate with our specific ideas once Ambassador Bolton has had a chance to dig into this issue and come up with the best way forward. We have every reason to believe he'll do that.
We don't necessarily accept Donald Trump's assessment, but he did raise a provocative point, and we will follow up. We think that it's important. Well, I think we have exhausted our members, and so thank you so much for your testimony. What do you want to stay? I understand some of the members are coming back, so if you don't mind, we'll take a short recess. Thank you.
Thank you.
The committee will come to order. The gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Leach, is recognized.
Thank you, and welcome, Ambassador, Mr. Secretary. There are a couple of ways to look at this issue. One is exclusively in U.S.-Indian relationship realm. One is in the non-proliferation realm, and further, just the arms control treaty realm. And I stress the third because there have been several people in this administration in the past that have argued that arms control treaties don't matter. And I say this very seriously, people that have held very high office in this administration. We began with the first administration to have rejected a comprehensive test ban. The first, even though the Senate also did in the late 90s. But since Dwight David Eisenhower, every administration has supported a comprehensive test ban. We began with a turning back on a negotiated treaty to increase the verification provisions of the Biological Toxin Weapons Treaty because it was allegedly too intrusive on us. Now, the reason I say this is that you very calmly said that one of the trade-offs was that India would continue not to test nuclear weapons. Is there any consideration in this administration of returning to a test ban? Is there any consideration in this administration on reviewing whether or not we should have rejected a treaty to increase the verification provisions of the Biological Weapons Convention? And I raise this in this context. This administration chose not to consult with Congress on this change in policy. Did it consult with other parties to the treaty, the NPT? And are we taking an approach that is unilateralist in judgment? And I really stress this. I mean, how widely was this issue discussed? How broadly? And what was it paired against? I mean, we all wanted to make symbolic gestures to be closer to India. The self-apparent gesture was support of India for Security Council membership. You have laid a basis, largest democracy in the world, about to be the largest country in the world, about to be one of the 5 major economic powers, and yet the administration hasn't come out in support of India entering the Security Council. And if one was looking for a gesture for a visit of a head of state, this seemed to be the self-evident one. And instead you chose a tack that has some argument for it. I mean, but it seems to me a tack that the argument for it should be one that should be really talked through as well as thought through. And I don't sense that occurred here. Now, do you have a response?
Sir, if I could just address the issue of the role of arms control in our national strategy, a strategy that the President articulated as early as December 2002. This administration, I believe, has taken a very pragmatic view toward arms control. It finds arms control, effective arms control, to be an important tool, one of many tools. One of the first things that I did when I joined the administration, which was at the beginning of the President's first term, in my capacity as his senior advisor on counterproliferation issues, was ask the negotiator of the BWC protocol to do an assessment as to whether or not that protocol would contribute to detecting cheaters or to deterring cheaters, the purpose for which it purportedly stood. The results were that no, it would not. It would not contribute to either one of those goals. And so we took the stance that we should not go forward with that protocol, but that we ought to focus the work of the BWC arms control community on very practical steps. And we were successful in changing the focus of the work program, and we've had concrete results since. Our purpose is to use arms control as an effective tool of nonproliferation, not to support arms control for the sake of arms control. And I think you can see that in the context of the Chemical Weapons Convention, we have worked to strengthen that the treaty and the OPCW. that performs the verification mission for that treaty. We have taken very important steps to strengthen the NPT on the nuclear side. We have not taken a unilateralist approach to non- or counterproliferation. The President, I think, has been very creative in creating new tools to deal with this very complex threat. It was the President who announced the initiative for the Proliferation Security Initiative, an initiative that did have a very important impact on Libya's decision to eliminate its nuclear, its chemical, and its long-range missile programs. It was this President who put forth the initiative that resulted in UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which is designed to put in place in national laws effective penalties, in effect criminalizing the type of activities that we saw with the AQ-CON network. It was this President who established the initiative that led to the G8 Global Initiative that seeks to double the amount of resources that are available to non-proliferation assistance programs, the non-LUGAR type programs, making it not only a responsibility of the United States and the United States taxpayers, but also an international responsibility in which others need to contribute. I think we have stood for effective multilateralism, and I believe that the policy on India should be seen in this context.
Did you discuss this with other countries before you changed policy?
Did we discuss the change of policy with India?
With the NPT, other parties to the NPT.
I don't know, Nick, maybe you can take that. I did not.
Congressman, you asked a fair question about consultations with the Congress as well as other countries. We began during Secretary Rice's trip to Delhi in March to talk about the outlines of this new relationship in all of its dimensions, not just the nuclear field, but the others. And as we approached the visit of Prime Minister Singh in mid-July, we had conversations with a few of our allies in Europe, in fact, with the Indians, about what we might be able to do to gradually integrate the Indians into in terms of practice, compliance with non-proliferation regimes. We also did not believe, frankly, for a long time before the visit that it would be possible to reach this agreement. In fact, we negotiated for the 4 days prior to the Prime Minister's arrival with the expectation that the barriers between us for an eventual agreement were too high. And so the reason we didn't come and brief the Congress is because until the very last moment it was not clear to us that we'd be able to reach an agreement. We actually reached this agreement largely through discussions that Secretary Rice had the day prior to the visit and the morning of the visit. And what the last piece of this was the reciprocal piece that Congressman Lantos mentioned in his remarks, and that is that we were not willing to enter in an agreement unless we had a visible and verifiable set of commitments that the Indian government was willing to undertake, and we achieved those just a few hours before the President sat down with the Prime Minister. So we certainly apologize that we didn't have the opportunity to come and brief, but we frankly did not expect to make the kind of progress we did in the final days. Now, we did reach out to senior members of Congress within an hour after the President and Prime Minister had met, and we certainly want to assure you that we're here today and we'll be here as many times as you'd like us to be on Capitol Hill to discuss this with you and seek your counsel. And finally, on the UN Security Council, Secretary Rice had said as early as March that international institutions like the UN are going to need to adjust themselves to India's growing role in the world. But frankly, and because of the debate we had here between the Congress and the administration on reform of the UN, we felt it would send the wrong signal if the United States focused on UN Security Council expansion in the month of July and August, when in fact the real need was for management and budget reforms. And so as a tactic in our negotiations at the UN, what we said publicly was, we want to take UN Security Council expansion off the table, because that would be a major commitment. And we don't want to make that commitment to other countries until we can be assured that the United States nations is a reformed institution. So prior to Ambassador Bolton's arrival, we took that initiative, and Ambassador Bolton has continued that. And we'll be happy to discuss UN Security Council expansion and whether or not we'll support other countries for that, but only when we see the progress on management, budget, Human Rights Council, peace-building commissions, terrorism convention, and development are major priorities. And we hope to achieve those, we hope, by the summit next week that President Bush will attend.
Mr. Lantos.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend both of our distinguished witnesses. I want to commend the administration for new thinking vis-à-vis India. I think the time is long overdue for new thinking vis-à-vis a number of countries. I made 5 visits to Libya as part of new thinking. I was in North Korea in January, and Mr. Leach and I spent last week in North Korea in dealing with the range of problems we have with North Korea. And I think the strategic vision which is implied in attempting to make India a major partner globally in the 21st century deserves nothing but commendation. And I want to commend Secretary Rice for recognizing it and for acting on it. My concern does not relate to the administration. My concern relates to the insensitive thinking that I see coming out of New Delhi. It is incomprehensible to me that people as sophisticated and as knowledgeable as our Indian counterparts should not be aware of how significant their position vis-à-vis Iran is to this Congress. And I hope that this hearing will make them aware, at least tangentially, that they may be destroying far more significant relationships than the ones they are having with Tehran, unless they become sensitive to our views on that subject. Libya has made a 180-degree turn with respect to developing weapons of mass destruction. This past week, Mr. Leach and I spent several days and maybe as many as 25 or 30 hours in discussions with the North Koreans on the substance of their return to the six-party talks, what they can expect of us and what we expect of them. And the very fact that they are returning to the six-party talks, I believe, is a good sign. We made it clear to them that we will be supportive of a variety of educational, cultural, and athletic exchanges that will begin the process of changing the climate. I indicated to them I will support the application of the Pyongyang circus to visit the United States. And I hope they will proceed with that move. And I will be coming to you, Secretary Burns, to lobby you that you should let them in. The Iran issue is not a side issue for this Congress. It is the single most important international threat we face. A reckless Iranian government proceeding arrogantly, with the development of nuclear weapons. Only an imbecile would believe that they are developing a nuclear program for peaceful purposes only. And it's an insult to the intelligence of Congress that they keep repeating this. Every time they repeat it, they add to the number of members of Congress who are totally cynical of what they're saying. But they do what they do. But to have the Indian foreign minister, and I will find a quote here with respect to his recent meeting with the Iranians, say, they really don't care what we think. To have the Indian foreign minister say this and expect support from the United States for permanent membership on the UN Security Council, which I think is long overdue, or legislative changes with respect to the nuclear issue that we are discussing, shows a degree of denseness that occasionally very intelligent people are burdened with. They're brilliant and they're dense. They're brilliant, which is obvious, but they are simply dense because they are incapable of comprehending that other countries have very important concerns. And my hope is, Ms. Secretary, that those of us who support the administration's policy, as I do, will be able to assist you in bringing reality to Indian thinking. And I'm coming to my question, my bottom line is that I do not oppose the administration's policy. I support it. But I believe the administration will have to make a maximum effort, and we offer, at least some of us, our services to help you, to make the Indians aware of the fact that nothing will fly in this body unless they become as sensitive to our concerns as we have been to theirs. Now, may I ask you specifically, Ms. Secretary, what discussions have you had or has Secretary Rice had with the Indians concerning their Tehran policy?
Congressman Lantos, thank you very much, and we share your concern. I discussed this issue with the Indian government over the last 2 weeks on 2 occasions, and again yesterday with the Indian government. I'll have another conversation tomorrow morning. I know that Secretary Rice will be meeting with both the Indian Prime Minister and the Indian Foreign Minister in New York during the UNGA meetings, and I'm sure she will raise this issue with them as well. When you were out of the room for the vote, we took both Undersecretary Joseph and I responded to a question from the chairman on this, and what we said was that we believe that India shares our goal of preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons power. And now what we're discussing with the Indian government this week is tactics. How do we do that? It's the belief of our government that there has to be a series of graduated pressures placed against the government of Iran through the IAEA, through the United Nations Security Council, through the actions of the European Union. It's their agreement that has been violated unilaterally by Iran, so that Iran will return to negotiations so that we can have a peaceful, negotiated settlement of the problem. Back in March, when the President and Secretary Rice decided to support the European negotiations openly for the first time, and to make the 2 gestures that we made to the Iranian government on allowing spare parts for their civilian aircraft to flow from the United States to Iran, and not objecting to Iran's beginning a relationship with the WTO, we did that on the basis of one principle, that we are committed to see that Iran not become a nuclear weapon state. And so it's very important that India, China, and Russia, and South Africa, and Argentina, and Brazil, and the other countries, leading countries of the world, join with the United States and the European Union to see that that does not happen. And we have a way forward. The IAEA and UN Security Council can take action to put pressure against Iran as a first step.
I found my quote, and I will ask you to comment on it. The Indian foreign minister, this was 3 days ago, at a meeting with the Iranian president, the new Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, in a meeting on Saturday. The visiting Indian Minister of External Affairs said the following: his country supports resolution of Iran's nuclear issue within the IAEA framework and opposes sending the file to the UN Security Council. Singh lamented, I want to read this very closely, because this is sickening, literally sickening. This is Stalinist rhetoric, which we don't accept from the Indian foreign minister. Singh lamented the inclination to infuse injustice in international relations, reiterating that, I quote, India's relations with Iran is not predicated on positions and views attributed to some governments. That's you, Mr. Secretary. Now, the injustice that he refers to is the judgment of this country, both the administration and Congress, that given the record of cheating and lying on the nuclear issue by Iran over a protracted period of time, we won't accept their statements at face value. The Indian foreign minister considers this injustice. This pattern of dealing with us will not be productive for India. And they have to be told this in plain English, that this great new opening, which I support, I think we all support, is predicated on reciprocity. In this case, they are not only opposing our views, they're opposing the views of the Brits and the French and the Germans. If they persist in this, this great dream of a new relationship will go down the tubes. I'd be grateful if you'd comment.
Thank you, Congressman Lantos. What I should say is that we have seen the same quote that you have. What I cannot know, given the vagaries of the international press, particularly coming out of Iran, is whether that's an accurate statement, whether it's a full statement, whether he said other things that might mitigate some of the sentiments expressed in that statement. So what we've done is we've registered our concern with the Indian government, of course, and we've said to the Indians that we hope that they will retain support for the decision that they helped us to take on August 11th in the IAEA Board of Governors, which is to encourage Iran to come back to the negotiations and refrain from the processing of uranium or any other stage of the nuclear fuel cycle. And we are working very hard to see that by September 19th, we might have a united international community. I think Under Secretary Joseph, in his earlier response, has noted, and I very much agree with him, we're not completely assured of success because we're dealing with a large number of countries in the IAEA, but you can be assured that the United States, working with the European Union countries, is going to make sure that we do what we have to do diplomatically to ratchet up the pressure against the Iranian government and to convince it to come back to the talks.
You have our full support in that. The question is not whether you have our support in this, which you do. The question is, if you fail, what will the Indian position be at that point? Because if India at that point will tell us, go fly a kite, the goodwill will dissipate. And they will pay a very heavy price for their total disregard of U.S. concerns vis-a-vis Iran. It just will not fly in this body. And they need to be told that in plain English, not in diplomatic English. And I know they have people in this room who will carry this message. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Burton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the views expressed by my colleagues is shared by almost all of us here, if not all of us. And so I hope you'll carry that back as kind of a unanimous feeling. One of the things that I'm very concerned about is the stability in the region vis-a-vis India and Pakistan. And while we've offered this kind of an agreement with India, I haven't heard any kind of a similar agreement discussed with Pakistan, and I understand they've made some comments about that and have expressed concern that there hasn't been that kind of an agreement discussed with them. I'd like to know if that's in the works. Pakistan has been a friend of the United States through so many conflicts in so many ways. Musharraf has taken tremendous pressure during this war against terrorism, and he's been a strong ally. And I'd just like to know, and you don't have to go into great detail about this, but I'd like to know, are we considering, or have we considered, or have we discussed with Pakistan similar agreements?
Congressman Burton, you can be assured, and Congressman Lantos as well, we'll carry the message we've heard today on Iran back to our discussions tomorrow morning with the Indian government.
Good.
You asked a question about Pakistan, Congressman. I would just like to make two remarks. I know Undersecretary Joseph will answer your question in detail. We are trying to do what we can to support the growing rapprochement between India and Pakistan. You mentioned that at the beginning of your question.
Good.
And while, and we know that there's an important meeting that will take place next week on September 14th between President Musharraf and Prime Minister Singh in New York City on the margins of the UN meetings. And we wish both of them well, because both of those countries, if they can work together, diminish tension in Kashmir and in other parts of their relationship, they both can be a force for peace and stability. And you're correct to say that our administration, we very much agree with you, is putting a lot of emphasis on our bilateral relations with Pakistan. Pakistan is a key ally in the war against al-Qaeda. Pakistan is a key ally in our efforts to fight the Taliban in Afghanistan. And in terms of the stability of Afghanistan, the stability of the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan is critical. And so we've just had meetings over the last couple of days with the Afghans and Pakistanis.
That's very good.
On that issue.
I'd just like for you to answer the question. Are we tendering any kind of a similar agreement with Pakistan?
And we have not.
And your rhetoric is very good. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, will you consider that?
Why don't you take it?
I mean, they've been our friends and allies, and we want to work with India, and we are moving in the right direction. But Pakistan is right next door. We've had conflicts in the past. And it seems to me that since they've been taking the brunt and Musharraf has had his life threatened and everything else, we ought to at least consider a similar agreement with Pakistan as we continue to work with Pakistan and India to solve the problem of Kashmir and so forth, which I think is very promising.
Congressman, let me just respond very briefly and add to what my colleague has said. Pakistan is, of course, an important friend and important strategic ally. We have not given consideration to extending this type of cooperation to Pakistan. Pakistan doesn't have the same energy requirements, of course, that India does. And also, as we have made very clear, part of our consideration is the establishment of a long, positive non-proliferation record. And so as we look at that, and as we take that into consideration, we have made the determination that we need not move to establish the same type of cooperation with Pakistan.
I wish you would elaborate just a little bit, because I don't understand that. You said we need not. Why do you say that? You know, Pakistan and India have been like this for a long, long time, and Pakistan's developed a nuclear program because they felt they needed to for security purposes. Now they're talking, and I'm very happy that Singh is talking to Musharraf and vice versa, and they're trying to work out their differences. But it seems to me that since Pakistan and India are right next door, that we ought to, and Pakistan's been such a good friend, we ought to at least consider talking to them about a similar agreement.
Well, we are, of course, working with them to engage diplomatically with each other, to undertake greater confidence-building measures, to take measures that will provide greater restraint in the nuclear weapons context. But in the context of providing full assistance or full trade on the civilian side, that is something that we don't think we are prepared to do. And again, I think it goes to the question of energy requirements, and it goes to the issue of the non-proliferation record. If I could, I'd also like to say just something brief on Iran in response to Congressman Lantos'
Well, can
statement.
you do that on someone else's time?
All right.
Because I think this is important, and I don't want to get off of this subject because I think it's important that we do what you're doing with India. But Pakistan has been an anti-terrorist state under Musharraf. They've been doing everything they can do to help us. They helped us in Somalia. They helped us during the Cold War. They've been our friend forever. And it seems to me that we should extend the same courtesies and potential agreements to them that we have India. At the same time that we're congratulating them and working with them for a solution to Kashmir and the other border disputes that they have, other problems that they have. And so for the State Department to extend this olive branch, if you will, to India, I think is good. I think it's great. India is a very large country. It's a democracy. It's growing in the right direction. But it seems to me that we ought to also consider this very seriously. And Pakistan, as I understand it, has asked for this consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Berman.
Interesting. Before I get into it, because I'm going to talk about the last issue for a moment, but I don't know if anyone from the government of Pakistan is here, but there's at least one member of Congress who very much appreciated and would like the Pakistani government to know that it was appreciated that the Pakistan's foreign minister was willing to meet with and have a dialogue with the Israeli foreign minister in Istanbul last week. And was it last week? Yeah. But what my friend from Indiana, the issue he raises is very interesting. I mean, one could note that while we talk about Pakistan's current effort to fight terrorism, on the issue of proliferation, talking about India and Pakistan in the same terms makes no sense whatsoever. I'm curious, but doing this with India raises the expectations in Pakistan, and I think understandably, well, if they got it, why can't we get it? And we're allied on many things, and we have key interests in common, and you're dependent on our cooperation in some areas. So it is one of the foreseeable consequences of what you've done with India that you raise expectations in Pakistan about this issue. The issue of implementing, but I wouldn't want you to go away. You may see a consensus on this committee regarding India and Iran. I hope you don't come away from those comments seeing a consensus on the issue of whether or not such an agreement should be offered to Pakistan at this time. I assume from what Secretary Joseph said that there are expectations with respect to India in fulfilling its commitments under the Civilian Nuclear Energy Agreement, and that therefore you do not have in your back pocket and have not yet presented to the committees the kinds of legislative changes that will be needed to implement that agreement. Implicit in your comments was some notion that you want to see some actions on the issues you ticked off by India before you push in Congress for that legislative change. Is that a correct assumption? Am I drawing the right conclusion from your comments, or do you have a piece of legislation that you have given or are about to give to Congress?
No, we are not at a point where we have any draft legislation that we would provide to Congress. We want to, of course, work with Congress in determining the best way forward to adjust our laws and policy.
Well,
we have begun the review.
This isn't pardon the expression, nuclear science. I mean, we have laws prohibiting certain kinds of exports and cooperation, which would have to be changed for this agreement to be implemented. One can the Congressional Research Service has done it. Others can very easily tick off what those laws are, and I'm not quite sure what you mean by, if you're talking in some political sense, perhaps, but draftsmanship is not a complicated issue here, is it?
No, but I was going to say that we are in the process of reviewing the various options for dealing with that. We know that under the Atomic Energy Act, there are exemptions, there are waivers to deal with the specific sections. It may best be that we would like to have new legislation. We have not made a determination as to how we see the best path forward. We want to consult with Congress on that.
Okay. Well, let me ask you something then. You talked about a number of things India will be obligated to do. Part of it was refrain from proliferating. I mean, I'm no expert on this, but my understanding is that there's never been a serious concern about India proliferating. Is that a reasonable conclusion? I'm not a concern. There's not a record of evidence of India having proliferated its nuclear technology.
That's right. On the nuclear side, I think India has a very sound and solid record.
I did note that part of these commitments involved adherence to the missile technology control regime and other issues where maybe that record isn't so clear or they weren't obligated. But as you approach this legislative issue, and you deal with the question of what message do you send to the rest of the world, is your approach a generic approach? Countries that separate their facilities, countries that provide safeguards on their civilian nuclear, allow safeguards and IAEA inspections on their civilian nuclear facilities, countries that commit rigorously to a regime of non-proliferation, both in nuclear and in missile technology, that they will then be eligible for this increased cooperation? I mean, is that the underlying logic of this?
I think our approach currently is to treat India as a unique case. But it may be that, and we're in the process of reviewing this, and we're in the process of consulting with Congress on this, it may be that the best approach for dealing with India is to establish a set of criteria, both in the NSG context and perhaps in the context of legislation.
In other words, a menu of what one must do to participate in a civilian nuclear energy cooperation agreement with the United States.
That's right, a set of criteria or a menu, yes.
Right. And then my final point, if I just may be allowed to ask it.
If you do this quickly, you're
yes.
right over.
Okay.
We've been generous with time.
Okay, well, and then I won't do it, because you've been generous, and there are other people here.
We'll come back then, Mr. Berman, that's fine. Ms. Russ-Leighton.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for being here today. And certainly Tom Lantos, Joe Wilson, Ed Royce, and I, we are very positive proponents of stronger relations between U.S.-India. But I am, along with Mr. Lantos, I'm very concerned about Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons program in complete disregard of its international obligations. And I just want to dovetail on what my friend Mr. Lantos was talking about. For close to 3 years, the International Atomic Energy Agency and the EU3 have been trying to induce and coax Iran into suspending uranium enrichment activities and other problematic activities. And what has happened? Iran has made a mockery of these efforts. And now the threat of United Nations Security Council referral has also been a cause of little concern to Iran. In March of last year, the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors adopted a resolution with what many consider to be a trigger mechanism for Security Council referral. Yet nothing happened despite Iran's continued breaches. So it is further difficult for Iran to be concerned about any United Nations action or any EU action against it when European countries continue to invest billions of dollars in Iran's energy sector, and yet U.S. law, specifically ILSA, is not fully implemented. So we must be fully committed to denying Iran the technology, the financial resources to pursue its nuclear weapons, its terrorism, and other unacceptable behavior. And this brings me back to the topic, the U.S.-India partnership, and India's commitment to complete a multi-billion-dollar deal with Iran for a pipeline when there are so many other countries which India could turn to for its oil and gas needs. Reports say that India is in agreement with Iran's nuclear program because India views it as a peaceful effort, but this is disconcerting from an ally, a strong ally, a positive ally such as India. And so to continue with the line of questioning that you've heard from other members on our committee, what specific requests for cooperation have we made to India on Iran's nuclear pursuits? And what have we asked India to say to non-aligned movement countries at the IAEA to support U.S. efforts? And because we're at a critical juncture with Iran, we can't continue to ask for goodwill gestures from Iran. Economic incentives and goodies have failed miserably. And so it's time to ask for more from our allies, starting with India, and I promote stronger ties, but also from our European allies, and also from Russia and Pakistan and so many others. We can't wait, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, there are varying estimates as to when Iran could have a nuclear weapons, and we can't wait for that time to lapse. And I would also like the administration to take another look at H.R. 282, a bill that I have on Iran. It has 320 bipartisan, obviously, co-sponsors, including 2/3 of the members of the International Relations Committee and members who are rapidly losing patience with what is going on between our actions on Iran. And I'd like for you to respond. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We are specifically asking India to join with us and the other countries of the IAEA to agree on September 19th to refer Iran to the UN Security Council. At the Security Council, we would plan a graduated series of steps designed to place additional pressure on Iran to convince it to come back to the talks with the Europeans. I don't believe we've heard the last word from the Indian government. As we have both noted in our testimony today, the Indians were with us on August 11th at the IAEA, and we have a very active diplomatic campaign right now. It's led by the Europeans, but we're very much in support of it, to have a successful IAEA meeting on the 19th and then successful action of the Security Council. On the pipeline, of course, we're not in support of that type of venture. I don't believe that there's been any specific agreement between Iran and India to go forward, but there's a lot of talk. In fact, there were even statements made yesterday about it. And so we continue to have that on our diplomatic agenda with India as well. We will certainly take a look at another look and be happy to discuss with you your bill on Iran. There's a major focus in our government right now on Iran. There's a new Iranian president. He is certainly in many ways more conservative in terms of his domestic orientation than the previous government. We have not, of course, had any discussions with the Iranian government. It's the only country in the world with which we have no diplomatic communication. But our sense is, as is yours, that this is a government that is bent on breaking away from the Paris Agreement. And it's done it on a unilateral basis, and that, in our view, is unacceptable. So we have this firmly within our sights.
If I could just add that I certainly agree with Congressman Lantos that a nuclear-armed Iran represents the greatest state threat to us as a nation, and I think to the international community. And for my part, I believe that referring Iran to the Security Council should be considered a standard of responsible non-proliferation behavior. In November 2003, the IAEA board did find that Iran had committed serious breaches of its obligations, of its safeguard obligations. At that point, we deferred our attempt to refer Iran to the Security Council in order to allow the EU3 process to have a chance of success. And since then, we have taken a number of steps, as Undersecretary Burns noted, to support that process. But with Iran crossing the red line of beginning conversion activities at Isfahan, that process is now suspended. Now is the time to refer Iran to the Security Council, and that is something we are working very hard with India and also with other governments that, quite frankly, aren't supportive of that move. And we're also working with the IAEA leadership to achieve that outcome. But there's a great deal of resistance, not just on the part of India, but on the part of many governments who don't seem to place, quite frankly, non-proliferation and Iran, a nuclear-armed Iran, at the top of their priority list.
Mr. Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The false assertions that we made to the United Nations and the world about Iraq, what damage has that done to our credibility in the region and in the world when it comes to asserting that Iran is engaged in a nuclear weapons program?
I have not heard anyone, and at least in conversations with me, anyone from a foreign government say anything about Iraq and connect the failure of intelligence with regard to WMD in Iraq to the situation in Iran. The findings of the IAEA inspectors are sufficient to lead to the conclusion that the board made that Iran has seriously breached its obligations. And that's been the basis of the discussion, as has their violation of the Paris Agreement.
Do the Middle Eastern countries believe that?
Believe the IAEA
No,
inspections?
Believe our assertion that Iran is a great nuclear threat.
I believe that they accept the findings of the IAEA investigation. I believe that anyone who looks at those findings and considers the 19 years of denial and deception by Iran and the huge investment they have made in a clandestine program, that the only conclusion one can draw is that there's a nuclear weapons program.
I'm not talking about one drawing the conclusion. I'm talking if we spoke to the ambassadors of Middle Eastern countries, the Arab countries, would they say this is the same old, same old?
No, I think they're very concerned that Iran will acquire nuclear weapons.
Let me go to your statement, Secretary Joseph. You note that the President's going to review progress on the agreement that's been announced when he visits earlier this year to India. What expectations do we have for what that progress will look like? And does the President expect to have in hand all of the congressional authority that he needs to proceed with the deal? And equally important, what expectations does the government of India have with regard to progress on the agreement?
I think that by the time that the President and Prime Minister meet again, we will have progress in a number of areas. I think by that time, India should have identified the facilities in terms of the separation of civilian and military facilities and activities. It should have begun in-depth consultations with the IAEA for the application of safeguards on the civilian side. It should have also begun in-depth discussions with the IAEA on the additional protocol. These types of steps, I believe, should and will be taken by that time.
Let me ask Secretary Burns, good to see you again. We've made a number of commitments to India with regard to what we will do internationally and domestically, and they've made a series of commitments to us. How do these two sets of commitments interact? Do we expect India to take certain steps first before we act, or are they supposed to be concurrent steps?
Thank you, Congressman. They're reciprocal, and we would expect that we would establish within the next several weeks a schedule of concurrent actions, meaning that we would want to see the United States would want to see the Indian government begin implementation of the commitments they have made to us. And in turn, the Indian government will expect that we will be working in the Nuclear Suppliers Group and working with the Congress to identify a way forward. I have explained to the Indian government that given the complexity and importance of this arrangement, it's going to be necessary for us to see a commitment and a date certain by which some of the actions will be taken. And I sense this morning that that's also your expectation. And if I could just, with your permission, Congressman, just also add to your first question on Iran. It's difficult to generalize about the Middle Eastern countries and the world at large, but it's almost a given in international politics that behind the veneer of a peaceful civil nuclear program in Iran is undoubtedly nuclear weapons research and the objective of attaining a nuclear weapons capability. That is a given, not just in the United States, but as we talk to countries in many parts of the world, that is, in my experience over the last several months, has not been contested in any of the conversations we've had. So there's no debate in private diplomatic circles about the problem. The debate is about how we achieve a stop to those ambitions.
I'm just wondering if they think if that's a good thing or not, the Iranian pursuit. But let me pursue what you just brought up for a moment. You brought up the Nuclear Suppliers Group. How have they reacted to the proposed agreement? In your testimony, you mentioned Great Britain, but what do the others have to say about this? China, Russia?
When we have talked with our foreign friends, we have received a, quite frankly, mixed response. There are some who have been very supportive. You mentioned the United Kingdom. I was in Russia on the day that the announcement was made, and the reception was very positive. As I mentioned, the head of the IAEA was also positive on this. Other countries have expressed reservations. Some have actually expressed opposition to this.
Could you tell us who?
Sweden has made public statements that are really quite negative, for one. But we intend to work with all of them and to share with them the full understanding of the commitments, in particular, that India has taken on, because, as I said, on balance, the net is a very positive gain for non-proliferation.
If the chair would indulge another quick follow-up?
I'd rather come to a second round, if that's all right.
That's fine with me.
We've gone several minutes over, if that's all right. Let me apologize to Mr. Roebacher. We have a very specific order. We have Mr. Royce, Mr. Wilson, and then, is that all right? All right, Mr. Royce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the ironies here is that once the NPT mores are compromised, it could open up efforts with states that frankly have a very poor record with respect to proliferation to petition for inclusion in the exemption. And frankly, on that list, I can't think of a country that's been more problematic than Pakistan for the international community. And A.Q. Khan, the father of their nuclear bomb, as you know, proliferated to Libya that we know of, in Iran that we know of, and North Korea that we know of, and other states where they made treaties that we're not certain exactly what transpired, but there was an attempt made. And I know you know this, but the possibility of such an agreement with Pakistan would be a non-starter with Congress. But nevertheless, it raises the issue. There's some other issues I wanted to get a better understanding on as well. And one is, this is going to require a consensus of the 44 states that our signatories, the Nuclear Suppliers Group is going to have to sign off on this, and I'm not certain how you're going to build that consensus. I know that it's only been a year since China signed up on that as part of that agreement, and I was interested in their position. I assume you've had some discussions with China to see if they would support this effort, and so I thought I'd ask you that. Secretary Joseph?
Well, specifically with regard to China, we of course have addressed this issue with them. I think their posture, like a number of other countries, has been to ask questions, the types of questions that we've fielded here today.
You testify that the U.S. remains committed to achieving an Indian cessation of fissile material production for weapons, and we've strongly encouraged a move, in your words, in that direction. But I'd like to hear a little more about that discussion and whether or not you think that can be achieved.
Well, of course, the joint statement calls for India to support the conclusion of a fissile material cutoff treaty. We, quite frankly, would like to see more done prior to the conclusion of that treaty, if that treaty is ever successfully negotiated. We think that there are a number of options that we can work to encourage India, as well as Pakistan and others who are currently producing fissile material for nuclear weapons, to curtail, to cut off that production. And we intend to work with India, not as a prerequisite for this agreement, but to provide greater non-proliferation benefits in addition to those that are numbered in the joint statement.
And how high a wall do you anticipate there would be, Secretary, between our cooperation with India's civilian nuclear program and its military program? Because, as you know, the civilian and nuclear program at this point are commingled in India, and there are some who are suggesting that it would be very difficult to separate these activities. I know the agreement calls for that separation. And so I'd ask you how long that separation would take and how important is that separation? How important would it be to have that completed before the United States engages with Indian nuclear technology and with the industry there?
Congressman, I certainly can't tell you how long it will take. It is a complex endeavor, but it's a critically important one. As you know, under Article 1 of the NPT, we can't do anything that supports the Indian nuclear weapons program. So what we need is a credible and defensible separation of their civilian.
And the IAEA does that, right? They negotiate that.
Well, the IAEA will provide the safeguards for that separation.
Right. So, but they negotiate those safeguards.
They do negotiate those safeguards.
So that's going to be a sort of a pivotal part of this agreement is getting safeguards in place that satisfy you with respect to that.
Well, I think it's critically important.
Firewall.
But as we have both said, I mean, what we're talking about is a reciprocal and phased approach to the implementation of this agreement. And I think forward progress and submission, for example, by India of a credible and defensible separation or plan for the separation of civilian and military facilities will be a very important step, allowing us to take important steps.
And lastly, do I have any time left, Mr. Chairman? I don't. Okay. You'll back the balance.
But we may come back.
At time. Thank you.
Mr. Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On about the 19th of this month, the 35-member IAEA board is going to meet to consider the Iranian nuclear program, specifically the issue of whether to refer this to the UN Security Council. We knew this showdown was coming. It was either inevitable or incredibly likely. We made an agreement with India that is quid pro quo. We got some very positive comments from India on the safety of its nuclear program from a proliferation standpoint. On balance, were it not for the one issue I'm about to mention, I would say it's a good agreement. However, as Mr. Lantos pointed out last weekend, the Indian foreign minister met with Iran's new president and stated that his country does not support referral of Iran's nuclear program to the Security Council. I want to associate myself with Mr. Lantos's comment. The fate of this agreement in Congress probably depends on Indian actions in about 10 days in Vienna. But my question to you, gentlemen, is this. Did it cross the mind of anybody at Foggy Bottom in negotiating this deal with India to get an absolute commitment that India would be with us, and if you couldn't get that, at least an absolute commitment that they would abstain on this upcoming issue? To put it another way, did we ignore the most important nuclear proliferation issue facing America today, namely Iran, in negotiating a nuclear treaty with India?
The answer is no. We've had discussions with the Indians for many months on the question of Iran.
Why did we give them what they wanted and get nothing on the Iran issue?
The two issues weren't linked. This was an agreement.
Why did we choose not to link the most important issue for American national security in negotiating nuclear issues with India?
There was no reason to do so, Congressman, because...
No reason to do so.
If I could just finish my answer.
Because nuclear weapons will not be developed in Iran, or because they can't be smuggled into the United States?
If you'd like me to finish my answer, I will.
Please finish.
Good. We had no indication from the Indian government that it would somehow deviate from what we considered would be the action of the IAEA should the negotiation with Iran be broken, and that would be to support concerted action. Indeed, on August 11th...
You had no idea that India wouldn't be with you, and now they're against you? Us? Please continue.
I'll just be happy to finish my answer. And that would be that we negotiated the deal with India in the latter part of June and the first part of July. On August 11th, after the deal was negotiated with India, the Indians supported us and supported the position of the Europeans and the IAEA Board of Governors. We hope that the statement by the Indians the other day is not the last word, and we've been working with the Indians assiduously on this problem. So, no, we have not taken our eye off the ball, Congressman. We've had our eye right squarely on it, on Iran.
I would hope that in a matter this important, you would get definitive commitments, not just indications. The fact that somebody's with you on a related issue in the early summer is not a definitive commitment to be with you in the fall on a different issue. And if we should not operate under the assumption that a country is going to vote for referral to the UN Security Council unless we have a commitment that they're going to vote to refer to the UN Security Council. And the fact that they've been with us on preliminary votes is not a reason to fail. I won't say that you ignored the issue, but to fail to get a definitive commitment as part of the overall agreement.
We understand the Indian position to be that it does not wish Iran to become a nuclear weapon state. And India has been consistent in saying that. In fact, I believe they just said it the other day.
Iran has said that too.
So the question here is tactical. And our administration, our government, has made this a focal point of our foreign policy to deny Iran the capability. So we've been working on this very hard.
I would say your administration's failures with this are demonstrated again and again, and your president has announced to this country again and again that we have sanctions on Iran that we do not have. You've ignored the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. You've violated the law by failing to acknowledge the existence of agreements reported in the Wall Street Journal as being fact. To say that our administration is doing anything is to confuse statements of policy with real action. And the action here of putting us in a position where we've already negotiated the deal and we have no commitment on what you say is this very important issue is consistent with the fact that we refuse to enforce the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. I yield back.
I strongly disagree with you, of course, on what you've said, Congressman.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. And again, as the former co-chair of the India Caucus, the largest caucus on Capitol Hill, it's particularly appropriate that I come after Ed Royce and that he was the chairman before me. And he did a great job building this caucus. And I had learned, and I agree with you, the statements that y'all have made about the shared values we have in the global partnership that we have now. The world's oldest democracy, the United States, the largest democracy, India. My relationship, my dad served in India during World War II, and so I grew up with an appreciation of the people of India. He told me how hardworking they were, entrepreneurial, and now we see that coming to fruition. Additionally, I've worked very closely with the Indian American community in my home state as a real estate attorney. We very much appreciate that Indian Americans are crucial. They're the third largest immigrant group in the United States, over 2 million people who add so much to the United States in terms of our culture and economy. Additionally, I'm very grateful in the global war on terror that we're allies. And this is particularly significant because India has lost 60,000 people in cross-border terrorist attacks, and so they understand what we're facing. And I know the joint military exercises we've had are unprecedented, very positive. And then in terms of trade, I was glad you pointed out that the United States is the #1 trading and investment partner of India. Last year we had an increase of 23% in terms of exports from the United States to India. As we go over the broad scope of U.S.-India engagement, and there's been so much positive that's come about, and with the wonderful visit of Prime Minister Singh, a question I have, the issue of civil nuclear cooperation has become the most visible issue in bilateral relations. If each of you could comment on how did that become #1?
Congressman, I think there's broad-scale agreement that we ought to be expanding our relations with India on science and space, agriculture, democracy promotion, the areas that you've mentioned. We understand that the agreement made by President Bush and Prime Minister Singh on civil nuclear energy is complex, and it does raise lots of questions about whether or not there's going to be a fulfillment of the agreement on a reciprocal basis. And so we certainly understand that this is perhaps the one that has received the most attention, and we expected that. And so we briefed the congressional staff in the days and weeks following the summit meeting on the outlines of that agreement. And we know that on the Senate side of the Congress, there'll be hearings on this particular issue as well. We've had a chance to talk to many members there. But we're convinced that this deal is in our national interest. And we think the greatest advantage is that it takes a country that had stood outside of the international non-proliferation regime, and it begins to bring it into practice, into conformity, I should say, with the practices of that regime. India is not going to formally join the entire apparatus, but if it can begin to be responsible for bringing its practice into accordance with that regime, that is a step forward for the United States and for non-proliferation. When the President talked about this arrangement, when Secretary Rice did, that was the central point that they made.
I would say that it's likely the most visible because it is the most significant departure from business as usual. It's a fundamental change from the non-proliferation approach to India of the past, which we believe has not worked. And I believe that this fundamental change should be seen in the context of other measures that the administration has taken. I believe we have a very strong, very effective record on the non- and counter-proliferation side. The President has been very creative in fashioning new tools to deal with this complex threat. We've got to treat different circumstances differently. As I said in my opening remarks, there is no viable cookie-cutter approach to non-proliferation. That's why we have come up with the Proliferation Security Initiative. That's why we have fashioned the global partnership. That's why we're working very hard on WMD terrorism. We are taking new approaches to counter non-proliferation, and we're producing results. We've produced results with the unraveling of the AQCON network, the Libya decision to abandon its weapons programs. And this is another new approach, and we believe that there will also be positive reactions and positive responses and results to this initiative by bringing India into the non-proliferation fold.
And another area of cooperation you mentioned that I think is exciting, and that is promotion of democracy. And in Central Asia, I've had the opportunity to visit a number of countries and in Western Siberia and Russia, and to me it's a great opportunity for India. And with the elections in 10 days, historic, in Afghanistan, are they participating in any way in promoting the development of the emerging democracies of Central Asia?
Congressman, I don't know what specific actions the Indian government has taken in Central Asia, but I do know that the Indians have agreed with us that democracy promotion is a virtue and should be part of their foreign policy as it's part of ours. And next week, President Bush and Prime Minister Singh will have a joint statement and agreement to support the UN Fund for Democracy. So we're pleased by the commitment that they've shown.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Before turning to you, Mr. Crowley, let me just note, Mr. Wilson mentioned his father lived in India. Actually, his father was a flying tiger flying from India. And last week, Mr. Wilson represented the Congress, the American people in China, celebrating the 60th anniversary of the end of the war. And we're all very appreciative of your work, Joe, and your father. Mr. Crowley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you both for your testimony before us today. Appreciate you being here. I too am a former co-chair of the India-American Caucus here in the House, and have dedicated a good deal of my time towards furthering better relations between the United States and India. And I think the caucus, and Gary Ackerman being amongst its founders, Ed Royce and others, Frank Pallone, and a number of others who will go unnamed at this point, to help create the caucus here in the House. I don't think it's any coincidence that we've seen an advancement in relations between the two nations that coincides with the establishment of the caucus here in the House of Representatives. And just last year, you know, the Senate has formed a similar entity within the Senate to help further promote exchange between the parliamentary governments of the United States and India and the two democracies. I have followed very closely over the past few years the New Delhi Declaration as well, and I want to express my concern, as I have consistently expressed my concern with the Indian government, of their furthering of relations with Iran for delivery of what is obviously needed fuel to help spur this ever-growing economy in India. I don't dare say that I would necessarily agree with everything my colleague has said, and I appreciated the exchange that took place between the two of you, Ambassador Burns, but I would be still interested to maybe get a fuller explanation as to why there may not have been a connection made between cutting off that relationship in exchange for. But before we get to that, I think what's important is confidence building, and that's something that has really taken place, I think, over these last 12 years or so. And I agree with my friend, Mr. Robacher from California, when he said in his opening statement about this being a realignment, a post-Cold War realignment that is taking place. And I would add to that I think that this is natural causes of a greater alliance between the United States and India. And I have to go through them all. I think they're fairly apparent to all. But it's also realignment, in my opinion, that's still very much in flux. It's, you know, things are still working out. They may be solidified for many, but for me personally, still speaking, there still seems to be a lot of different relationships that are gelling out there. And in terms of compromise, in terms of confidence building, I know that there is a high-level team, for the lack of a better word, composed of our military as well as our industry in New Delhi, and they're briefing the the Indian government on the MRCA competition. And I'm wondering if you can, Ambassador Burns or even Dr. Joseph, you can comment as to whether or not you believe our government is serious about winning that competition and allowing that to go forward. Does the administration see a timeline for that competition and successfully seeing that through? It's my understanding that the French and Russian governments are determined to win those contracts, and I'm wondering how determined our government is to seeing that contract through. And I think the reason why I say that is I think a failure to achieve a contract with India as it pertains to the MRCA, I think would be a setback in many respects for U.S.-Indo relations, and I would like to have you comment on that if you could.
Thank you, Congressman. We're determined that American firms will win that competition, and we assume it's going to be a free and fair one, balanced. And we've met with the American companies involved, and we'll continue to support them in their competitive venture with some of the European firms. We have a growing defense relationship with India. Defense Minister, Secretary Mukherjee was here in early July to meet Secretary Rumsfeld, and we announced the greatest expansion of military relations between the two countries, including in the commercial military field, that we've ever had since 1947. I think you're right to suggest, and we all feel this, that the relationship is evolving. We had a fairly strained relationship in the 1950s, 60s, 70s with India, two very different countries with different views of the world and their roles in the world. And what has changed beginning in the early to mid-1990s is the worldview of both countries. And as we increasingly see terrorism as a threat, proliferation as a threat, HIV/AIDS as a global security and health threat, we see India as a partner, and India sees us as a partner. I think that is the basis for this new strategic relationship, which is not yet fully developed. It is developing, and I agree with your assessment of that. I would like to say about the first question you asked, it's the same question that Congressman Sherman asked. The agreement between us was a bilateral agreement on civil nuclear energy cooperation. I suppose that either of us could have linked it and made it conditional on any number of issues. We could have done it, the Indians could have done it, and I don't think we would have had an agreement on any of the issues that were brought together on the 18th if we had said, well, we mean this, but only if you do X, Y, or Z. That's not normally how international agreements are made, and that's not how this one was made. I think that's very defensible. At the same time, we were given no reason to believe that India was not with us and not with the European three in trying to force Iran to fulfill its own commitments. At the time the agreement was made, Iran was in negotiations with the European three, and while a breakdown of those negotiations was always a possibility, it was not a certainty. It became a certainty in the first week of August.
Would you say, for the record, that this administration is concerned about the Delhi Declaration? Is there a tremendous concern within the administration?
We want, as part of this developing relationship with India, we hope that we can be together with India as responsible powers in trying to thwart those countries that would seek to break out of the international system like Iran and seek a nuclear weapons capability. We have a very strong view of what the Iranians are doing, and we're determined to stop them. And we want Indian support and expect Indian support on this issue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Crowley. Yes, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Well, being one of the only members of this committee who never served as a co-chairman of the India caucus.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield for a second?
Certainly.
There's always time.
Oh, boy. Let me just note right off the bat that what Mr. Sherman and, although he was a little bit tougher, but also what Mr. Lantos has expressed today is a bipartisan mandate from this Congress that we expect this administration to be tough when it comes to India's relationship with Iran and the development of nuclear energy in Iran. The Indians need to know this is another time of choosing. In the past, they chose to be in a closer relationship with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And this is a time of realignment again, and a period of choosing for them. They can choose to be in a closer relationship with this outlaw mullah regime in Iran and radical Islam, or they can choose to be in a closer tie with the people of the United States of America. That's their choice. It's your job to make sure they're making that choice, that they understand as they move forward, they are the ones who are determining the policy of how their relationship will be with the United States. And I would hope that the Indians, now we know that India needs energy. We know that it's going to need oil and gas, and we know how much that's playing on the Indian decision makers. But we can make up with that, and that's why this is such an important strategic move on the part of the administration to offer some help in the civilian nuclear energy field to help offset that need for energy from perhaps unsavory regimes like that of Iran. So I applaud the administration for having the foresight and the strategic maneuver here of trying to make India less dependent on the mullahs for energy and perhaps achieving the other goal at the same time. But let me say that I think it is a horrible waste of resources for both India and Pakistan, either one, to be spending their limited money and the limited resources of their people on developing nuclear weapons. This is a horror story. Mazarov, in the past, I remember he said, well, our people will eat grass, let them eat grass, if it means having the pride of having their own nuclear weapons. I don't know what kind of kook would say something like that. I mean, the fact is, the people of India and the people of Pakistan, instead of spending hundreds of millions of dollars on nuclear weapons, should be spending on health care, on water purification, on education. And the fact that we now, again, and perhaps we should be stressing, and I noticed in the President's proposal, we're also suggesting that perhaps missile defense is a better investment and involvement with the United States than building nuclear weapons. And again, another strategic move on the part of the President that I think has great foresight. And we now, thanks to the commitment we made in the past, starting with Ronald Reagan, we have a missile defense system that could come to play and play a role right here. So these are all important things. One thing about this, I would hope that as we move forward with our cooperation with the Indians on civilian nuclear uses, that we pay close attention to the technological developments that have recently taken place. Being a senior member of the Science Committee as well as this committee, I can tell you that General Atomics in California, for example, has developed some new nuclear power generation technology that does not have the same implications for weapons that the current nuclear energy technology does. And we should be stressing that with the Indians. And I understand that it actually eats the fuel from nuclear weapons rather than creates it, which is a wonderful thing. Perhaps you'd like to comment on some of those points.
Congressman, if I may, I would just respond to 4 of your points. First, we as an administration, like past administrations, are working to get India and Pakistan to exercise greater constraint in terms of their nuclear weapons programs. That's a very important goal for us. We also support the development of more proliferation-resistant technologies, new types of reactors, fast reactors that actually burn plutonium and don't make more plutonium. We're looking at the entire fuel cycle to develop greater capabilities, more efficient and affordable capabilities that are also more non-proliferation friendly and more proliferation resistant. In terms of being a time of choice, I couldn't agree with you more. It's a time of choice not just for India, but for many other states, for Russia, for China, for others who are on the fence right now on the issue of Iran and specifically referring Iran to the Security Council. As I said earlier, I believe that we are at a breaking point in the context of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. We need, for the sake of that regime, for its future, for its viability, to address effectively Iran as a proliferation threat. And finally, just personally, I would thank you, sir, for all of the support you have given missile defense over the years. Missile defense is an important counterproliferation tool in the context of addressing the new threats that we face from proliferation.
Right. By the way, I don't believe those countries are on the fence about Iran. They're on the fence about the United States of America. That's what this is all about. They're going to choose either to go independently of the United States and perhaps against the United States in their overall relationship in the world, or they're going to be on our side and they're going to be part of our friends. That's what's being decided here.
I agree with that. I was referring to another choice, and that is their choice to either see the nuclear non-proliferation regime work or perhaps make it irrelevant.
Right, and which goes a long way to deciding if they are a friend or not. One last note, and then Mr. Burns will probably want to have a comment, Ambassador Burns, not just about this last comment of mine, and that is, there's been a major irritation that has caused an infection that threatens the life of people in that region, and it's been festering for 50 years. And I would hope that India that we just not turn our back and ignore it until the people of Kashmir are able, through a referendum, through a vote, to determine their own destiny. There's going to continue to be a festering problem in that part of the world. And nothing would be better in our interest than to finish this fight between India and Pakistan. And I would hope the administration does support democracy for the people of Kashmir. Not a deal between Pakistan and India, which is moving forward, but let the people of the Kashmir just determine that. When they do that, that will take away a huge problem that has caused this separation and the waste of so many resources.
We have very strongly supported the recent rapprochement between Pakistan and India. As I mentioned to another member, there's a meeting next Wednesday between President Musharraf and Prime Minister Singh.
Let us hope the rapprochement leads to the people of Kashmir having the decision and not just the big guys, okay? Because we can set up the meeting with the big guys all day long, but radicalism will spring forth from Kashmir if they aren't given their chance. Same way with any other people of the world. But anyway, I think you're both doing a good job, and my commendation to the President for what and to both of you as well, for what I see as long-term strategic thinking that's very evident here.
Thank you.
Without objection, members will have 3 days to submit opening statements and to revise and extend their remarks. Let me thank Ambassador Burns, Undersecretary Joseph. This is an extraordinary policy initiative, and you've taken the challenge of describing it well, and we appreciate it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Committee is adjourned.
What time is it? Oh, yeah. Okay, well.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Congressman.
Did you have 1 minute to talk
Yeah.
to Obama? Just
Yeah.
maybe in the background.
I sure do.
Just 1 minute.
I definitely do. Let me just get my
That's
notes.
great
together.
testimony. It's good hearing. I mean, it's contentious, but
That's a big issue.
yeah, this is realigning the whole world.
But you were not opposed to getting the documentation ahead of time.
What do you mean by documentation? You mean in terms of like draft LOAs, anything else to help us with it? If that's what you think would be helpful to...
I thought Rose raised that with you, and you thought it was okay that she deliver. I'm just confirming what I've been told, that it's okay to provide that to you as early as tomorrow.
That's fine, as long as you're not saying that the pre-consultation